It's been a very long week and I haven't started this coffee yet, so I've got a croissant too.
Sorry?
I've got baked goods as well, but I won't eat them while we're... Well, maybe I could, and then it'll be atmospheric.
That may be a little more atmosphere than our listeners want.
It's fine. This is important Foley work for a modern professional woman. Advocate, mother, podcaster.
Sure.
Not eating breakfast, wolfing it down and making you listen to it.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your annual deep dive into the climate and energy measures in the Australian federal budget. I'm Nick Miller, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Global Vice President for Revenue and Expenses of the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Hello, good morning.
And a man who recently charted a course from the increasingly turbid waters of Twitter to the warm corporate bath that is LinkedIn, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Hello. I don't really know what I'm doing in LinkedIn as yet, so apologies to anybody who I appear to be ignoring. I'm not ignoring you specifically. I am just flailing around in a sea of ignorance and incompetence, all of it mine.
I think I saw you tweet a link to a LinkedIn post and I'm like, ooh, the transition is hard for you, isn't it?
Yes.
I don't even think you and I are connected on LinkedIn.
I'm useless.
I thought that you're not connected with Tennant on LinkedIn, Frankie, was a power move.
Frankie's got standards.
Possibly just neglect on both sides. We will remedy this at some point, Tennant.
Okay, on this week's show, we have heard your requests, nay demands, for a rapid response episode on this year's federal budget, which means we're skipping the opening segment and getting straight into the hottest of hot takes on Jim Chalmers' pronouncements as they relate to climate and energy. Frankie, I didn't get to Canberra as I was grounded in Melbourne with a bad cold, but you were actually in the budget lock-up and walking the halls on the Hill. What was the mood in the nation's capital this week?
I think it's sort of fair to reflect that over the years. It's gotten a little bit quieter in Canberra around budget compared to pre-COVID times. And I think a lot of that is, the fact that people can do media from anywhere across the country. And so if you're a talking head for an organisation, it used to be that you'd come out of the lockup, which I'll talk about in a sec, and then do your customary tour of the Canberra Press Gallery and talk to all the journos and media assembled there. And while that's still there, I think there's a lot more flexibility in terms of how people engage in that commentary immediately post lock up and the Treasurer's speech at 7:30. But in my case this year, I went to the stakeholder lockup. There are a couple of different ones. There's one for media that happens a bit early in the afternoon. I think they go in at about 1:30 in the afternoon and they have their 3-hour session. But for stakeholders, there's an allocation of tickets where you get to surrender your phone and other internet-enabled devices. You're allowed to take a laptop in, but you're going into Parliament House, surrendering your phone, demonstrating that your laptop's on flight mode and you're not going to do anything sneaky. And then they lock you up in a series of rooms. This year it was some of the private dining rooms up on level 1, and in an environment I cannot say was at all COVID safe. We were shoulder to shoulder crammed around a series of tables, and you sit down with your laptop and someone comes and gives you a stack of hard copy budget papers if you requested hard copies, and a copy of all the papers on USB. And so that happens about 4:30 in the afternoon, and you get the next 3 hours before any of this is public knowledge to pore over those budget papers and write up your summaries and prepare media releases and things like that. And then you're let out at 7:30 just as the Treasurer is taking taking the floor in the House of Reps to deliver his budget speech, and often kind of furiously communicating what you found out in the previous 3 hours back to colleagues and anyone else who needs to know for the purpose of media or communicating that more broadly. So for policy wonks like us, it's a lot of fun. I mean, the food, Parliament House guys, was looked pretty terrible. There were some very sad-looking samosas sitting in a corner that I didn't touch.
It's a tight fiscal environment, Frank.
It is. I don't think anyone's there for the food. Let me put it that way. So I was head down, bum up for 3 hours, poring over what were a very comprehensive list of budget announcements. And in my day job, obviously, climate and energy is one part of what I was looking at, but there were lots of other things across the budget as well that I was recording.
Lots of climate-related stuff over and above the energy stuff that is a big part of all of our day jobs. Tennant, what stood out for you at a high level?
So some stuff, of course, is announced before the budget is released, because there's so much in any given budget that governments get worried the goodies are going to get not they're going to miss out on their time in the sun, or the baddies need a bit of time for people to get used to them, so that budget night itself can be more of a good news story. So we had already heard about the Small Business Energy Incentive, which is a bonus 20% rate of deduction for small and medium enterprises that do energy efficiency and electrification upgrades in the 2023-24 financial year. And that's budgeted at $300 million, but it's uncapped. So it's just a function of how many businesses are able to get themselves together in time to do an upgrade, noting that they're going to need the tradespeople, the equipment, and the space in their activities, their production schedule, whatever, to be able to do a significant upgrade.
And it's a 1 year measure, right? So the clock is ticking.
That's right. Get your skates on. So that could wind up being very significant. If it's not very navigable and the rules for deductions are too complex or the supply chains are troublesome, it might not be very big. So really, we're rolling the dice a bit, but there's a lot of interest in making that work. I'll say something that's not there in the budget, which is there's this measure for small and medium businesses. The safeguard changes that we've talked about so much will encourage efficiency and electrification among very, very large energy users and emitters. And then there's a bit of a gap for energy users that are businesses too big to be in this small and medium category, but they're not safeguard. And, they're not getting whacked with a stick, and they're not getting tantalised with a carrot, and they're just kind of in limbo a little bit.
But, I think to that point, Tennant, it is a little bit of a glaring gap, but we could surmise that that's probably because the government's in the process of developing this National Energy Performance Strategy, and we would expect to see policies targeting that cohort come out when that strategy is sort of ready to go, and perhaps next year is the budget year for that cohort of business.
And there is a bit more clarity coming out of this week around the spending that has been previously announced. In fact, it was an election commitment around the Powering the Regions Fund, and there is that $400 million which has been given to ARENA for the Industrial Transformation Scheme, which is available to NGA's entities, which of course includes some safeguard entities, but also goes well beyond that, right?
Yeah, that's true. So the Powering the Regions Fund was committed at $1.9 billion, and they've allocated $1.3 billion of that in measures this budget. And so there will be measures to support a range of businesses in particularly in highly affected regions, in facilities affected by the safeguard mechanism. There's also, in amongst all of that, $3.9 million, as somebody was kind enough to point out on LinkedIn, To run a little review of policy options, including a carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Never heard of it.
No.
Can you tell us about it?
What's that, Simon?
It's the little $3.9 million that could.
That was a joke. Please don't tell us about it. We don't have time.
Moving right along.
But that's good. And that is a little bit of a theme through the budget, I might say. There's various processes, work that's been committed to, little pockets of money that has said, yes, we're resourcing effectively the public servants that we're going to need to prosecute this agenda. Implementation of the Chubb review recommendations is another. There's a little pocket of money in there for implementing some of the recommendations from the EV strategy. This is not sort of money that's available to the public. This is ensuring the public service is properly resourced to prosecute some of these agendas.
Yeah. Now, there's another one which we haven't talked about on this pod yet, but I've been tracking with interest and for the purpose of my day job, and that's the Guarantee of Origin scheme. So there's the GOO. There's, I think, just over 38 million over 4 years, and then reasonably substantial amount per year after that, about 6.5 million to establish this Guarantee of Origin certificate scheme, which is basically going to allow us to track and verify emissions associated with not just renewable electricity beyond the life of the RET, but also hydrogen and other low emissions products. So it's flying under the radar a bit because it's very early stages and there's consultation on the design of it, but it's incredibly important for the longevity of particularly voluntary demand the sort of the corporate demand for the purchase of renewable energy and wanting to claim that against net zero targets, as well as any other sorts of interventions we're considering in that space. So it's the provenance, it's the robust ability to track and surrender certificates so you can claim those against net zero targets. That's a very exciting piece of work, and it's good to see that funded too.
Some people absolutely hate the GOO. And I reckon we've got some GOO episodes in our future.
I think so. I mean, like I said, it's been bubbling away and there's been some early consultation, but its time will come on LMSU for sure.
That's probably not a bad segue into the funding that's been provided for revenue support for hydrogen. Tennant, did you want to talk to that?
Yeah, the Hydrogen Head Start is $2 billion. That's a few dollars.
$2 billion, in fact.
I'm told. And so a lot about this is not yet clear. What is known is that it is funding to support renewable hydrogen only, but the parameters of exactly how clean the energy input mix has to be, exactly how new the associated renewables have to be, etc. That's all to be decided, and the H2 GOO will be an important bit of infrastructure for assessing that stuff. But it's plausible that this is going to work out to provide contracts for difference for hydrogen production, topping up the revenue of those projects by as much as is needed above what they're able to sell the hydrogen to a private off-taker for. And that probably bidders will, for these contracts, will compete to offer the lowest amount of top-up that they think they need in order to get the contracts. So I've done some totally dodgy numbers that suggest if this is offering $2 a kilogram of hydrogen top-up, it could support 1 million tonnes of hydrogen production over 15 years. But really, we're just kind of pulling a lot of assumptions out of the air there. This is the thing, though. This is the federal government's bid for Australia to compete in a little way with the US Inflation Reduction Act and the EU Repower plan in terms of getting some substantial hydrogen production and experience and learning going on within Australia. it's not going to be anywhere near on the scale of what's taking shape in the States, but it's keeping a hand in.
It's potentially enough to appeal to companies that are definitely going to be setting up shop over there, but want to expand their operations in countries where it's likely to stack up. And this is that little sweetener that convinces them it's still a good idea to focus in Australia.
Yeah. The dream of Australia as hydrogen superpower, because we've got all these underlying advantages, is still a highly uncertain dream. For the foreseeable future, underlying advantage will have almost nothing to do with where hydrogen stuff gets built, but the availability of money-vomiting subsidies will determine that. And so can we remain in the game at a modest level of activity long enough for when advantage does matter, we have a critical mass to grow from, I think is part of the strategy here. Anyway, $2 billion. Get in it.
Well, I mean, in terms of the headline dollar spend in the climate space, that's probably top of the list.
Yes.
But not too far behind that is something that's probably very exciting to all of us. Should we talk about that?
Yeah, there's a really significant package focused on household energy performance. The biggest chunk of that is $1 billion being allocated to the CFC to provide lower cost finance in partnership with retail banks for higher performing homes. Talking around the traps, again, there's not a lot of detail. The focus of this package is really supposed to be on existing homes, but it's quite ecumenical in terms of the technologies that could contribute to that. Certainly a lot of the public communication has focused on solar and batteries, but there's certainly a broader view being taken in the role of energy efficiency and electrification. And this is a really significant step. The CFC has been active in this space for a while. They've had relatively small programs with Commonwealth Bank and Bank Australia. This gives them the opportunity with a new injection of capital to really scale that work up, and I think is a really significant opportunity to really build out the ecosystem of finance and ratings and suppliers and assessors that are servicing that market. And so the really important thing for that investment will ensure that it is not kind of off on the side, kind of doing its own thing, but is linking up with a lot of the other work that's happening within government around the expansion of NATers to existing homes, thinking about the skills and supply chains issues in the retrofit space, but as a important and significant commitment, and one that is happening so early in this government, and it's particularly significant because it wasn't something they took to the election. And so they have, through the process of putting together the National Energy Performance Strategy, which we haven't seen yet, but really identified this as a key gap, and they're acting on it. And they're not just acting on finance. There's also a really important package for social housing, Frankie. Yeah,
so we've got I think just over 300, it's about 300 million over 4 years from this year to go into a fund to support retrofits of social housing, which is incredibly important. And I know anyone who advocates in this space it typically supports the approach where we, to your point, Luke, we do need to build up this ecosystem of professionals and business models that are going to be able to deliver retrofits of our existing housing stock at scale over time. Like, the challenge is enormous, and the logical and right place to start with that is with our most vulnerable Australians. And so a focus on social housing from the government is, I think, most welcome. I think, again, advocates would say 300 million isn't going to touch the sides when you look at the size of the challenge. And I mean, you could say that of any measure that we're talking about here, be it hydrogen or whatever. So it's a really important signal and a solid start. The other thing to say about this commitment is, again, in a really fiscally constrained environment, the fact they've been able to secure that amount of new funding plus the $1 billion for CEFC is really substantial, and we understand that down the track, this is likely to be complemented with co-contributions from state and territory governments, who also have a role in supporting those cohorts of vulnerable and low-income Australians. So there will be more resourcing put into this, but that will come with contributions from the other levels of government, which is really good to see too.
I'd add that it's not just a fiscally constrained environment at the moment, but an inflationary environment. Yes. The labour market is tight, supply chains are stretched. I would hope that with this program or pair of programs in place, that as and when macroeconomic circumstances are more favourable for this, unfavourable for everything else, that is, if and when we've got a growth slowdown, we've got a looser labour market, that is more unemployment, and a need for stimulus rather than restraint, that these programs are something that's like there to be dialed up, to take to be counter-cyclical, and make a bigger dent in the sheer scale of the building upgrade task in front of us.
Yeah, and I guess before we move away from households, it's not quite a climate energy measure, but it's certainly an energy measure, which is the electricity bill relief, $3 billion to take pressure off small business and vulnerable households. That was previously announced. It's included in this budget. By all accounts, it has been a world of pain negotiating with the various state governments about exactly how that relief is going to be administered. It's coming off bills directly, which was decided was the way to provide that relief.
Allegedly without being inflationary. I'm not so sure about that.
Well, we'll see, right? It certainly means that there is a direct relationship between the government support and the energy bills that folk are paying, but it does free up money to spend on other things, right, Tennant?
Yeah. I think true blue economists will say it's just leaving people with more money to spend on things, and in this environment that'll be inflationary. But it certainly means that one component of the closely watched consumer inflation index will rise by less than it otherwise would have. So I don't know if you get into the psychology of inflation, and if a number that says how inflationary things are or how much inflation there is a lower number, does that help? Even if the total demand out there is still in excess of what productive capacity can supply. I don't know. I'm just some guy.
A shiny-assed wanker, I hear.
Well, that's an apt description.
Hey, can we do niche corner?
Niche corner?
Can a niche be a corner?
Can we do niche nook?
Niche nook. There's just a couple of things. Well, no, actually, one, there's a whole area we haven't touched on that is very much part of the energy and climate space, and that's the broader environment and biodiversity space. And
you can't put that in a corner.
Nobody puts the environment in a corner.
That's not my nook. I was just oh God, it's been a long week.
What's your nook?
Okay, my nook is something that's specific for the built environment and a small subset of it, and it relates to a tax incentive that's probably not broadly known. It's called the Clean Building Managed Investment Trust Withholding Tax Incentive.
Hold on to your hats.
I know.
This is a niche. You're right, Frankie.
Did I not declare this up front?
As advertised.
As advertised. So, without going into chapter and verse about this, this is a tax incentive that makes it more attractive for overseas investors that typically invest in real estate through managed trusts to get a better return on their investment by having a tax rate that is lower than the at-market setting. So if they were going to invest in, say, an office fund which owns a bunch of high-performance skyscrapers and CBDs, they pay a 15% withholding tax. If, however, under the Clean Building MIT incentive, all the buildings in that fund achieve a certain level of energy performance. So the benchmark relates to the NABERS rating scheme or the Green Star rating scheme. You're eligible for a 10% tax rate. And whilst that doesn't sound like a lot, it can actually be a very powerful incentive to direct investment for new buildings to target high performance. So what was exciting in this budget, and this is something that I've advocating my day job for a while, is to see the mandate of that scheme expanded. And so there is a modest expansion of this scheme to cover a couple of different building types that weren't eligible previously. So data centres and warehouses are now going to be included in that incentive. And if you think about where some of the biggest growth in property is out of the pandemic, particularly warehousing, industrial logistics, because of the growth of e-commerce and all of those things, this is potentially very exciting in that space. So, that incentive is going to apply from 1 July 2025 to new projects, and they're also raising the benchmark for what's considered a clean building to a 6-star NABERS energy rating or a 6-star Green Star, which again is, bumping up that threshold. So that's only going to be a really good thing for sustainable property. And I was very delighted to find that in my word searching of the budget papers. I was like, when I was all alone and nobody to celebrate with in the lockup for a couple of hours.
Well, now you've got all of us and all the summer operas to share in the reflected glow of your delight.
You now all know the Clean Building Managed Investment Trust withholding tax incentive is.
The one episode corner.
That's right. I don't think we'll be revisiting this corner on a regular basis.
This nook. Oh, no, good nook, but there are a few other things to get to, and I do want to spend a bit of time on the stuff outside of the energy space because it's really significant. We've known that there's an EPBC Act, Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act review, but there's also some really significant investments in new bodies and agencies that can support that infrastructure and the decision-making process around environmental approvals and the like, most significantly Environment Protection Australia. I thought that was a smart little bit of jiu-jitsu to keep the EPA moniker but turn it into Australia rather than authority so that it's not confused with state-based bodies. So this is going to be the environmental regulator, they're going to be the rule setter, they're going to be monitoring bad behaviour, but importantly, and this is the key in the framing that I've heard talking to people in Canberra, sort of a mechanism to accelerate decision-making processes and establish a lot of clarity around what the requirements are so that businesses are better placed to move through approvals processes in an efficient way. And so they're really trying to sell this as something that is not trying to shut down activity. And indeed, there is a lot of connections being drawn between the infrastructure that's going to need to be built around the renewable energy transition, the network infrastructure, the large-scale generation, and the importance to have a really efficient, well-resourced body that can support approval processes that are timely, because it's been a recurring theme on the pod. Like, we've got our work cut out for us getting all that infrastructure built and working through a robust approvals process which allows all the issues to be worked through and a yes or no to be given is going to be really, really important for that.
On the EPA side of this, the funding provided amounts to about $30 million a year, which is certainly enough to get started with. This is not going to be a gigantic agency at that funding level. But given that the vision of these reforms is for a lot of the enforcement of national standards to be done at the state level, with the as long as the Commonwealth is satisfied that the states are consistent with national standards, there'll be just that single point of decision delegated down to the state level. So the work for the feds to do will be moderated by that. But I think there's going to need to be plenty of monitoring on all quarters to ensure that the federal and the state pieces of these reforms are indeed resourced sufficiently to get the kind of timely decision making and high quality decision making that we do need. You can't execute an energy transition just by stopping things. You do need to start a lot of things and complete them. And in the process, we have got to keep stakeholders of all sorts happy, avert environmental damage along the way, but just get stuff built.
Yeah, like this is a really complex regulatory space, and the review of the EPBC Act has that's been happening for some time. So the previous government commissioned Graham Samuel to lead that review, and at its heart, was sort of to your point, Luke, nominally the federal government does have responsibility for making decisions on how environmentally significant land should be treated for the purpose of development. But in the past, a lot of that decision making has been delegated to states in a way that I think a lot of people involved would say is very time consuming, costs a lot of money and all of that. So the promise of this review was to definitely to streamline the process. I guess where it's at is that there's still a lot more work to do in terms of figuring out what falls within the remit of this the new federal body that's being created, and then what role the states will have ongoing. But the intention is well supported and very admirable from all stakeholders. I think the other really interesting part of all of this that's connected to the carbon market and a lot of the conversation we have around the role of ACCUs into the future is this commitment to develop a nature repair market. So the way to think about the nature repair market is it's going to sit alongside the scheme that we've got in place for the carbon market with ACCUs. And so for the purpose of complying with the EPBC Act, at the moment at the state level, which is where a lot of the authority has been delegated to, projects will have to effectively try and offset any biodiversity impacts their projects are having, usually through the purchase of certificates. Now, not every existing state has a scheme like that in place. New South Wales does. I think it's roundly criticised for not being very good, overly complex and things like that. What the nature repair market promises to do is to create a national scheme that would look at the creation of biodiversity certificates that could be employed for not just the purpose of compliance with the EPBC Act down the track for projects there, but also to try and encourage a voluntary market for positive biodiversity outcomes. So a little bit like what you're seeing in the carbon market, where of course, you had the compulsory acquisition of ACCUs, and now you're going to, see that driven through things like the safeguard mechanism, or the government's purchase of them for the ERF. Similarly, in the biodiversity space, companies that have nature positive plans or targets around biodiversity would be able to purchase these certificates, for the purpose of creating that positive biodiversity impact. So that's the intention behind the scheme. It's in its early days. It's good to see funding announced as part of this budget to go into the design and work for that scheme, which is going to be actually a lot more complex than the carbon space, to be honest. If you think about quantifying biodiversity is a very tricky business, and it requires a set of expertise that I think arguably doesn't sit with the existing regulator, the clean energy regulator that oversees the operation of the ACCU market. So the role of bodies like the EPA and others, the existing departments federally, all really needs to be worked out in the governance of this thing too.
People have some disagreements about the concept of a ton is a ton, but
they do.
Nobody advances the position that a koala is a platypus.
No. And therein lies the inherent complexity in trying to quantify biodiversity outcomes. So there's lots of important work to be done in that space. So it's good to see that resourced here.
All right. The other bit of important infrastructure I wanted to shout out, which is funded in this budget, is the establishment of Environment Information Australia, which is acknowledging that, significant data gaps exist in what's even happening in terms of environmental degradation in Australia. So the ability to properly focus policy is significantly hampered by that lack of information. And so this new body is going to be tasked with identifying those data gaps and helping to address them. So there's a bit of a theme emerging, right, of like where the government is seeing issues. It's like, whose job is this? And the response clearly is it's kind of no one's job. It's like, or it's sort of half someone's job or whatever. And it's like, right, well, let's just make sure we have that institutional infrastructure in place that allows us to have the right information and have the right actors able to prosecute the government's agenda. As always, we close out the bumper budget special of Let Me Sum Up with one more thing, in which we all share a detail from the budget papers that has captivated our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
Something that's exciting me about the federal budget is the mystery of NFP, not for publication, in relation to the fiscal impact of the government's capacity investment scheme, which is the agreement with the states that the feds will do something like contracts for difference to back in a bunch of dispatchable renewables to help ensure that the national electricity market doesn't run out of electricity at times of concern. And there's a lot about this thing that's unknown, and a lot remains unknown after the budget, because they're not saying how much it's going to cost them, because that would be commercially sensitive. But they have said they hope it fosters private investment of up to $10 billion and up to 6 gigawatts of firmed renewable capacity. And the first auctions will be for contracts in South Australia and Victoria. And I guess we'll find out.
And for my part, I'm very interested to see the role that the demand side plays in the CIS and that emerging infrastructure. The public kind of communication is really focused on those firmed renewables. Obviously, there's capacity on the demand side that could be unlocked by a well-designed scheme. So we're continuing to advocate strongly that that opportunity doesn't get missed. Frankie, what have you got?
So I think when you can look back at the budget cycle of a term of government, and look at things a little bit more in hindsight, you can start to see where foundations are being built for more action, and then potentially what follows. So, bit through our conversation around some of the things around energy performance upgrades, those are really good starts, and I'd hope to see in next year's budget more measures across the breadth of business and households on the demand side. Also, what's not here, but I don't think is sort of cause for alarm or anything like that, is specific, sort of explicit funding for this idea of developing the economy-wide net zero strategy that we've been sort of promised. from Chris Bowen's first annual climate statement. Now, the early work of that is just a lot of consultation and discussions with with all parts of the economy. So it's not necessarily an onerous budget commitment, but it'll be interesting to see how institutions like the Net Zero Authority, which received some funding in this budget, as well as existing ones like the Climate Change Authority, are going to play a role in that. So I guess it's trying to look at a little bit of, in a couple of years' time, how would we look back on this budget in terms of reading the tea leaves for what comes next. So solid foundations, but I think I'd hope to see more along the lines of setting up those big economy-wide frameworks in the next budget.
Okay, for one more thing, I'm just going to pick up on a budget allocation that Frankie mentioned in passing to the Net Zero Authority. We're going to be talking about this in some detail in an upcoming pod that we may have already recorded but have decided to put on ice because we got excited about talking about the budget. You'll be hearing our discussion of the Net Zero Authority on the next episode of Let Me Sum Up. But suffice to say, this is a new authority focused on supporting communities and individuals that are involved in fossil fuel industries to transition to a space where they can thrive in a net zero economy. It's an incredibly important body and another example of, institutional infrastructure being created by this government to ensure they have the resources and the organisations and the expertise to actually deliver this transition. And that leads to the final point I want to make, which is that it is very clear that this government is absolutely committed to taking on this task of economic transition as a core function of government. This was elevated to this centre of Treasurer Chalmers' budget. This was not just being spruiked by, Jenny McAllister and Chris Bowen, the portfolio ministers. This is a story that's being told by the Treasurer and the Prime Minister, and that's incredibly important because we're not going to get this done if this is an agenda that is on one of many on the periphery of government. This needs to be at the heart of government. It needs those central agencies and those leaders within the government prosecuting that agenda. And it's very clear they see this as their contribution to the ongoing national process of economic reform, which has stood Australia in such good stead over the journey. And they really are walking the talk of, making the argument publicly that this is their contribution to the ongoing reform agenda of Australia's economy, setting up this economy to thrive in a world that is rapidly transitioning to net zero, which is incredibly heartening because this won't work. This transformation won't work if it's kind of on the periphery of government. It needs to be at the heart of government, and I think we're seeing a lot of evidence in the first year of this government's term that that's exactly what they're trying to do.
Well said.
All right, that's our show for this week.
Budget Palooza.
Budget Palooza. Well, we're on various social media platforms. We're still nominally on Twitter.
I don't think I've tweeted in like 3 months.
It's a complex space, right?
Yes.
I get scared off every time I log into Twitter.
Twitter used to be where I went and had, fun conversations about energy stuff, and that's sort of kind of degraded. A lot of people left. Some people are still there, but they're not really engaging. And then I tried the Mastodon thing, and that's just like crickets. Like there's like 2 people there. And actually, honestly, the best conversations I'm having on social media these days are on LinkedIn. Who would have thought? Mm. So, welcome, Tennant.
I save your welcome until I show a greater degree of awareness of where the heck I am.
Anyway, we're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn, I'm on Mastodon. You can find us, connect with us, and certainly jump on some of the chats that we're having on those various platforms. We have a website. Frankie, what is there?
Back catalogue of delights, including this budget special for your listening pleasure.
So if you want to listen to this episode again,
Yes.
you could go to the website and press play.
You could. Well, why wouldn't you? Yeah, so our entire back catalogue of tasty climate morsels is on letmesumup.net, which includes, my fault, very extensive show notes accompanying each episode, but also a little look at our show art and little bits and pieces. So, check it out. It's a fun, welcoming place.
It is indeed. And, Tennant, we have an email address. What should people be doing with it?
People should be writing emails to that email address. That email address is mailbag@letmesumup.net. And don't send us emails about investment opportunities or the need to deposit money in an account temporarily while a Nigerian senior official recovers from a coup attempt or whatever else. Send us suggestions of reports that we should be talking about. We love to hear about more reports, and especially if they're in the region of 50 pages long at the moment is the sweet spot. That, and they're really good, tempt us. Send us an email of temptation.
Be the devil on our shoulder. All right, well, that wraps up our bumper budget special of Let Me Sum Up. For Frankie Muskovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.